B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Friday, February 2nd, 2018. After weeks of wrangling over a classified memo developed by partisans on the House Intelligence Committee, the Trump White House approved its release without any redactions and declassified it so Americans can see it. And I predict that both sides are going to claim vindication over the positions they took before the secret memo was released. And it does have some important elements. But overall, I have to be clear that this memo, while it reveals potential wrongdoing by the FBI and others before the super-secret FISA court, it is a confusing, specialized context that they have created. It drops into one period of the Trump-Russia narrative and tries to claim that because of wrongdoing before the FISA court, that the entire Trump-Russia investigation should be dismantled and we should all just move on. And that's pretty ridiculous in many respects. And you know that I'm skeptical of the whole initial arc that Russia hacked the DNC, gave that to WikiLeaks in order to tilt the election to Trump. And I have been candid that I believe Trump has been running a serious cover-up and has committed several acts of obstruction of justice. And so finally the memo was released in the early afternoon in Washington, and I delayed recording my podcast today, spent several hours reviewing the memo and lots of reaction to it. Now, in a thumbnail, the memo alleges that senior government officials favored Democrats over Republicans and accuses federal law enforcement officials of abusing their authorities when they sought permission to surveil a former Trump campaign advisor, Carter Page. And the thumbnail of the opposition, Democrats say it's a Republican attempt to push a narrative that would undercut the investigation into Russia's alleged 2016 election meddling and possible coordination or so-called collusion with the Trump campaign. Now, I'm going to dive into the memo and comment deeply on it. But first, let's get the reaction from the Donald. All right? He, early in the morning, tweeted, about 6:30 Washington time, the top leadership and investigators of the FBI and the Justice Department have politicized the sacred investigative process in favor of Democrats and against Republicans, something which would have been unthinkable just a short time ago. Rank and file are great people. So he's signaling that he loves the FBI like he loves so much else in our country. But his beef is with the top leadership, and he loops in the Justice Department in an effort to undermine Rod Rosenstein, the number 2 guy who nominally runs the Mueller investigation, and, of course, to try to undermine the Mueller investigation itself. Now, it's interesting that the FBI complained bitterly about this, and they do say accurately that the memo lacks context. And they demanded declassification, but, some redactions with any declassification, but there were no redactions committed against this document. Now, Adam Schiff responded to the president's tweet, "No, Mr. President, it's worse than that. The country's top elected leader has agreed to selectively and misleadingly release classified info to attack the FBI. That's what would have been unthinkable a short time ago." And in a press gaggle, the president made this incoherent statement at the White House this morning.
I think it's terrible. You want to know the truth? I think it's a disgrace. What's going on in this country, I think it's a disgrace. The memo was sent to Congress. It was declassified. Congress will do whatever they're going to do. But I think it's a disgrace what's happening in our country. And when you look at that and you see that and so many other things, what's going on, a lot of people should be ashamed of themselves, and much worse than that. So I sent it over to Congress. They will do what they're going to do. Whatever they do is fine. It was declassified. And let's see what happens. But a lot of people should be ashamed. Thank you very much.
So 3 times Trump said it was a disgrace, and twice he said that it's shameful or people should be ashamed. And this is a man who has no shame. So that is his reaction, and he clearly believes that this is going to help his cause. So let's go to the memo and the accompanying cover letter that came from White House counsel Don McGahn. It goes through the rules about classification, and that essentially the White House approved declassification on behalf of the majority members of the House Intelligence Committee who voted to release this memo. It's dated January 18th, and it is from the House Select Committee on Intelligence majority staff. The individuals are not named, to the majority members. So first and foremost, this is a partisan Republican document. So the purpose of the memo is described as raising concerns with the legitimacy and legality of certain justice and FBI interactions with the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, and to represent a troubling breakdown of legal processes established to protect the American people from abuses related to the FISA process. Now, let me be clear that the FISA court does not belong in the American system of government. It's an obscenity, and it has been widely abused, as I will note in a few minutes. And so it has no real credibility. We know that the NSA has lied to the FISA court in the past, and so to hear this allegation that the FBI misled the FISA court in order to get the Carter Page warrant, that's not a surprise. But there is no effort by members of either party to correct the aberration that is the FISA court, to provide more transparency. There were limited efforts in a law that was passed that made, very limited modifications in surveillance law that did provide a little bit of daylight in the FISA court processes, but it still remains highly secret, and the fact that we cannot see the application itself, I think, it speaks volumes. So we do get one tidbit of information that I've been looking for a long time. The application to the FISA court to surveil Carter Page was filed and approved on October 21st of 2016. Now, up until now, we've been led to believe that it happened sometime over the summer. This is an important factor. It also undermines the central claim of the Republicans on the House committee that somehow Carter Page was singled out here and that they had to abuse the process in order to get the FISA court to act. Now, we also have been told through previous leaks that initially, when the FBI asked for a warrant on Carter Page, the FISA court turned them down. We don't have a date for that. But for this warrant to be granted so late before the election, just less than 3 weeks, in fact, I think that that's an interesting fact that we have to keep in mind. So the memo continues, consistent with the requirements under FISA, the application had to be first certified by the director or deputy director of the FBI. It then required the approval of the attorney general or a deputy attorney general or the assistant attorney general for National Security Division. They're laying the groundwork here to impugn the credibility of Rod Rosenstein with that sentence. Then they say FBI and DOJ obtained one initial FISA warrant targeting Carter Page and 3 renewals from the court. Now, what they don't mention, which is a serious omission, is that Carter Page had been under surveillance as a potential plant or somebody who had been flipped by Moscow since 2013. And that's why I talk about the very circumspect view of this memo, which is really focused on a very narrow piece of a much bigger picture. And in many respects, it appears that the memo undermines the central thrust of the Republican attack with that omission. So then they say that the FISA submissions, including renewals, are classified. However, the court's rigor in protecting the rights of Americans, which is reinforced by 90-day renewals of surveillance orders, is necessarily dependent on the government's production to the court of all material and relevant facts. This should include information potentially favorable to the target of the FISA application. So, they're willing to say that Carter Page deserved an adversary proceeding, which I don't dispute. But the FISA court does not allow adversarial proceedings for any other hearing that it holds. And, for example, when a guy who's been framed by the FBI for so-called domestic terrorism, and there are hundreds of them, challenges the use of FISA-related material in the trial against him, they are shut down. And they are not permitted to attend the hearings where the warrants are executed. So this is a problem, but it's not isolated to the Carter Page picture. And, of course, the Republicans aren't interested in fixing the overall problem. They just want to show that they are victims of this court. So then they say that their findings indicate that material and relevant information was omitted. And here they make some strong arguments. They say the dossier compiled by Christopher Steele formed an essential part of the Carter Page FISA application, and that Andy McCabe, who just stepped down as number 2 at the FBI, admitted that in a hearing in Washington last year. That is a significant allegation. And they talk about how Steele was a longtime FBI source, paid over $160,000 by the DNC and Clinton campaign via the law firm Perkins Coie to obtain derogatory information on Trump's ties to Russia. Neither the initial application in October 16 nor any of the renewals disclose or reference the role of the DNC. We have to take that on faith because we know that Nunes himself has not seen the FISA court application. 2 of his staffers did. The initial application notes Steele was working for a named U.S. person but doesn't name Fusion GPS and Principal Glenn Simpson, who was paid by Perkins Coie, representing the DNC and the Clinton campaign. The application does not mention Steele was ultimately working on behalf of and paid by the DNC and Clinton campaign, or that the FBI had separately authorized payment to Steele for the same information. That's a dubious claim. Their next item, the Carter Page FISA application also cited extensively a September 23, 2016 Yahoo News article by Michael Isikoff, which focuses on Page's July 2016 trip to Moscow. The article doesn't corroborate the Steele dossier because it is derived from information leaked by Steele himself to Yahoo News. I'm not sure quite what they're arguing there. It's interesting that they leave out the name of Mark Elias, the lawyer at Perkins Coie who represented the Clinton campaign and the DNC and who secretly made the payments to Fusion GPS that we didn't learn about until October of 2017. Next item, Steele was suspended, then terminated as an FBI source. This is also a dubious claim because he wasn't under any kind of formal relationship with the FBI. He claims he went to them to report the disturbing findings that his investigation had produced. And they argue Steele should have been terminated before the court hearing in October. They say this should have happened in September. Now, that's just hindsight, and I don't put much stock in that. Before and after Steele was terminated as a source, he maintained contact with the Justice Department via then Associate Deputy Attorney General Bruce Orr, whose wife worked for Fusion GPS. They try to make a big deal out of this, but they don't provide any evidence of any collusion between the husband and wife. Next item. According to the head of the FBI's Counterintelligence Division, Assistant Director Bill Priestap, corroboration of the Steele dossier was in its infancy at the time of the initial Page FISA application, After Steele was terminated, a source validation report conducted by an independent unit within FBI assessed that Steele's reporting was only minimally corroborated. Yet in early January of 17, FBI Director Comey briefed Trump on the summary of the Steele dossier. And this is the reference I made earlier, that McCabe testified before the committee in December 17 that no surveillance warrant would have been sought from the FISA court without the Steele dossier information. So there is something of substance here, but it's buried in a lot of confusing, manufactured context. It suffers from serious omissions, and so it is a weapon. It is a document with selective information being used as a weapon. And in the final page of this document, pardon me, the FISA application also mentions information regarding fellow Trump campaign advisor George Papadopoulos, but there's no evidence of any cooperation or conspiracy between Page and Papadopoulos. And Adam Schiff, the ranking Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee, says that there is an omission there of information that made that connection. We're not so far permitted to know what that is. I mentioned in my commentary a moment ago that there is a history of people appearing before the FISA court requesting warrants or wiretap approvals and being accused of lying to the FISA judges. And back in 2013, Reggie Walton, who for a time was the chief judge on the FISA court, and before that he presided over Whitewater, the Scooter Libby case, he gagged Sibel Edmonds. He is a hardline Reagan appointee who supports the intelligence community 99.9% of the time. But he objected to a series of assertions made by the NSA in trying to win warrants from him, and he accused them of substantial misrepresentation. So keep this in mind, because you're going to see that neither Democrats nor Republicans will demand reforms to the FISA court as a result of these disclosures and exposure. And that is the serious issue that confronts the nation on a long-term basis, that to me is much more important than the political points that will be scored as a result of the release of this memo. Now, I want to briefly mention some of the published commentary on the release of the memo and react to it. Aaron Blake in the Washington Post writes, the Trump White House's laughable spin that the release of the Nunes memo is all about transparency. Well, he's right about that. The Trump administration is not the least bit transparent, and this is a very obvious act of self-defense. They believe that this is going to help them re-spin the narrative. At the New York Times, op-ed columnist Michelle Goldberg has quite a few whoppers in her column. She says, now to protect Trump, the right has expanded its war on empiricism to that most conservative of institutions, the FBI. And what I criticize is the way the Democrats embrace the FBI as this unassailable source of rectitude and righteousness and commitment to law and order and fairness. That is bullshit. The FBI is a rogue agency, and I've been saying that for years. All right, more from Goldberg. In their attempts to undermine the Russia probe, Republicans aren't presenting a coherent theory, even a coherent conspiracy theory. They're just sowing confusion and distrust toward the nation's premier law enforcement agency in order to protect the president. Well, that's partly true, except for the fact that the nation's premier law enforcement agency is corrupt and deserves a full overhaul. Then she says, we already know that it wasn't Steele who sparked the FBI's Russia inquiry, but Trump campaign advisor George Papadopoulos. We don't know that. That is another leak-based published item from the corporate media that has not been proved. She later says that Page, and this is correct, has been on the radar of counterintelligence agencies since at least 2013. But was the FISA court told that? We don't know based on the Republican memo. Then she says, in March of 2016, later that year, the FBI received a new secret warrant to monitor Page's communications after he traveled to Russia. Well, we really need to see the complete timeline of FISA court actions related to Carter Page. And neither side is served by this partial disclosure. Then she says, to some commentators, it is ironic that liberals are now defending the FBI. But liberals recognize the dangers of the campaign to broadly discredit the mainstream media, even though they had their own passionate criticisms of it. Well, the mainstream media has taken itself over a cliff in the Trump-Russia narrative, and I believe that serious damage will be done that will linger for a long time. Amber Phillips at the Washington Post says the memo reveals mistakes and even bias at the FBI, not with the separate independent special counsel investigation set up by the Justice Department. I think that's unproven because we don't know the role of the final Attorney General under Obama and other people at the Justice Department in maneuvering around the Hillary Clinton email investigation, that secret meeting the Attorney General had with Bill Clinton on the tarmac in Phoenix, and many other issues. And let's see, this Amber Phillips column asks, why would Trump single out the Justice Department to explain why this memo should be released? Because he thinks the memo will help him undermine the Mueller investigation. That's possible. The memo, she also says, the memo alleges the FBI relied on faulty information to start its investigation into whether the Trump campaign colluded with Russia. And I agree with that, and this is a Karl Rove tactic. Remember when Bush's service in the Texas National Guard was exposed by Dan Rather, and then Dan Rather got fired from CBS because Karl Rove's operatives had planted a document that they were able to say, look, this is a false document. And by pulling the thread on one item, they were able to persuade people that the whole case against Bush was false. And likewise here, if they can prove, one area where wrongdoing occurred, even deep into the timeline of the investigation and, just a few weeks before the election, they're hoping they can create the false perception that everything about this is just a witch hunt. Next, we go to Vice News, where Taylor Dolvin writes about Page being under surveillance since 2013. And he writes this, the FBI and Justice had the same memo, had said the memo leaves out key facts. We have grave concerns about material omissions of fact that fundamentally impact the memo's accuracy. And that is a fair attack as far as it goes. But of course, it's coming from the FBI, which is trying to cover up wrongdoing that probably occurred. And now back to the Washington Post, Jennifer Rubin, conservative columnist. The memo proves something that surely does not help the Nunes conspiracy theory, namely that the FBI was first alerted to possible interference from Papadopoulos, not by the dossier. But the earlier monitoring of Carter Page is what's missing from this whole effort to explain these things. So, I want to move on to other issues briefly here today. I want to recommend a column that I am linking to in the show file for today's podcast by our listener, Linda Lewis. She writes for Whistleblowing Today. She is a whistleblower herself, and she recaps the case of Jeffrey Sterling, the CIA employee who spent almost 42 months in prison after being accused of essentially making phone calls back and forth with the then New York Times reporter James Risen. And she points out that nothing the government presented to the jury showed that the two had discussed any classified information. And Sterling himself has stated that I was convicted of espionage based solely on metadata from phone calls and emails we had exchanged. Despite the lack of any direct evidence proving I was the source for Risen's book, I am now serving 3.5 years in prison. And Lewis correctly points out that there are implications going forward. The Sterling case has implications for the rest of the country that are more important now than ever, with ongoing investigations of possible abuses of power by the intelligence community. To prevent abuses and hold government officials accountable, journalists and whistleblowers need strong protections against government reprisal. But in its prosecution of Sterling, the Justice Department cast a chill over journalism and whistleblowing alike. Well done, Linda. Well done, I would say. Now, while we're distracted by all of these antics inside the Beltway, buried in the news today is a struggle between the White House and the Pentagon over North Korea. And get this, it's the Pentagon saying military options are not available. And the Trump White House keeps demanding more military options to attack North Korea. And H.R. McMaster, the General and National Security Advisor, keeps goading the Pentagon to give him more options, and the warriors at the War Department are saying no. They do not want to enable him to launch an attack that could lead to the imminent death of tens of thousands of people. And it was Steve Bannon, before he got booted from the White House, who told a journalist, "There's no military solution, forget it. Until somebody solves the part of the equation that shows me that 10 million people in Seoul don't die in the first 30 minutes from conventional weapons, I don't know what you're talking about." Keep an eye on that. Every day I like to pause for a second and thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. People like Paul Tomaselli. David Paulson just renewed his annual subscription. Thank you, David. Natalie Reel, Ethan Knox, monthly subscribers, kicking in $5. The cost of a hipster coffee. I'd like you to subscribe. Takes a couple of minutes. Visit peterbcollins.com. Pull down the menu, click on Become a Subscriber, gets you to the sign-up page. And as I mentioned yesterday, I'd appreciate it if you drop into YouTube, put Peter B. Collins in the search window, click on the page with my dog Chloe's picture, and when you get there, click on the YouTube subscribe button. You don't have to pay anything, but it will enable me to get some revenue from YouTube in the future. And listener John Zweibel, who's also a very generous supporter of this podcast, lives in Hawaii, but he's very actively supporting a man who is running in the congressional primary in Minnesota next week. And the man's name is Jeff Erdman. And I listened to an interview with the Progressive Talk station in Minneapolis. I've linked to that in the show file for today's podcast. And Zweibel is right. This guy is a real progressive. He is a high school teacher and football coach, and he identifies the serious problems in the Democratic Party. His rural supporters in the district don't see any difference between Democrats and Republicans, and he is a staunch supporter of issues related to climate change, campaign finance reform, single-payer health care, and I find him very compelling. I hope if you have time, you'll click on the link and listen to that interview with the candidate from Minnesota, Jeff Erdman. I am also linking to a really strong article from Truth Out written by Michael Corcoran entitled The People versus the Democratic Establishment, the Coming Attack on Progressive Candidates. And I won't take the time to walk through the article, but it references the autopsy that was completed on the 2016 cycle. It talks about the way the Democratic National Committee is chasing the wrong voters, thinking they can persuade the Democrats who voted for Trump last year to come back, when the real issue is turning out the people who believe in the original mission of the Democratic Party, which is largely lost in the current climate. There's also an important piece I've linked to by Caitlin Johnstone. She is the firebrand from Australia who has great perspectives on American politics. And she points out that Bernie Sanders, who has many great positions, in his response to the State of the Union message, repeated the same old bullshit of the Democratic establishment, and that is that Russia meddled in our election. Quote from Bernie, "How can he not talk," referring to Trump, "about the reality that Russia, through cyber warfare, interfered in our election in 2016, is interfering in democratic elections all over the world, and according to his own CIA director, will likely interfere in the 2018 midterm elections? How do you not talk about that unless you have a very special relationship with Mr. Putin?" Well, in a very gentle way, Johnstone makes the case that we can support Bernie and still separate ourselves from positions that he takes that aren't correct. And this is one that I, of course, agree with Ms. Johnstone on. Our friend Steve Horn has a new report at DeSmog Blog. The Iowa State Senate has advanced a bill which would add criminal penalties of up to 25 years in prison and a $100,000 fine to those who commit, quote, sabotage of critical infrastructure such as oil and gas pipelines. And he points out that this bill was written by ALEC, the corporate-funded American Legislative Exchange Council. The bill is very similar to the one that was passed in Oklahoma. And this directly impacts people like Michael Foster, who is the subject of our recent interview of the valve turners. And next Tuesday, he will be sentenced and faces as much as 20 years in prison for his act, his direct action in shutting down the Keystone Pipeline. There's a partial victory in San Diego in the years-long wrangling over who pays for the shutdown of the San Onofre nuclear power plant. And a settlement has been reached that requires the utility to pay an additional $775 million over what it originally had been told by the Utilities Commission it had to fork over. But I agree with Charles Langley of Public Watchdogs, who said this settlement is an outrageous sellout. Ratepayers should not have to pay anything. The failure of San Onofre was caused by Southern California's Edison's failure to deploy equipment that was approved by the NRC. This failure was 100% their fault, and it is an abortion of justice to ask ratepayers to pay anything. In a Lansing courtroom today, the judge who kind of went off the charts, her name is Rosemarie Aquilina, and when she sentenced Dr. Larry Nassar last week to over 100 years in prison, she really crossed a line and rejected the kind of demeanor we expected from our judges. She talked about how thrilled she was that she had signed what she called his death warrant. And she got her payback in the courtroom today because as victims were testifying, a man whose 3 daughters were all molested by Larry Nassar asked if he could make a statement to the court.
Say something.
Go ahead, sir.
Now, he's not a victim, but the judge allowed this.
In a courtroom, we don't use.
He called him a
profanity,
son of a
but
bitch.
If you have some words that you would like to say, I would like to give you the opportunity to say them.
I would ask you to, as part of this sentencing, to grant me 5 minutes in a locked room with this demon.
I have
Would
a
you
feeling.
do that?
That is not how
Yes or
our.
no?
No, sir, I can't.
Would you
do
give me
that.
1 minute?
You know that I can't do that. That's not how our legal system.
Well, I'm going to have to.
When a judge in her courtroom crosses the line and upsets the kind of decorum and standards that we expect, it invites this kind of reaction. Now, we can have great sympathy for the dad, and as this plays out across corporate media, there are going to be a lot of people who say, right on, Dad. But 2 wrongs do not make a right. And this is another sad day in the decline of America as we've known it. Thanks for listening today to my news and comment podcast. You're free to share it far and wide, and you'll find it on YouTube. I'm Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.